Dawn arrives without ceremony in the jungle. There is no sunrise here, only a thinning of darkness. Moist air hangs low between the trees, heavy with rot and cordite. Vines sag under their own weight. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an insect whines, then stops. The ground is slick. Mud grips boots like a living thing. A lone American soldier lies pressed into the earth, unmoving. His uniform is stained dark with sweat and soil. His breathing is slow, measured, each breath counted. In his hands rests a rifle that does not belong here, not in this war, not in this jungle. It is not standard issue. It came from a catalog, ordered before the war, when killing was theoretical and distant. They laughed when he arrived with it, a hunting rifle, a civilian scope, a mail-order gun. Now no one is laughing. Across the clearing, high in the branches of a banyan tree, something shifts, a glint, a shape that doesn't belong. The soldier adjusts his cheek against the stock. The world narrows to a single point. Distance calculated, wind guessed, time suspended. The shot cracks once, sharp, final. The jungle exhales. By nightfall, one Japanese sniper will be dead. By the end of 4 days, there will be 11. And the rifle they mocked will no longer be questioned, because what follows will force an entire unit to rethink how this war is fought. The reason this man was here at all begins far beyond this jungle, in a war that had already learned how to kill silently. By the time this soldier settled into the mud of the Pacific jungle, the war had already changed shape. The Second World War did not arrive in the Pacific as a clash of machines. It arrived as a war of distance, concealment, and endurance. When Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they did more than destroy battleships. They exposed how unprepared the United States was for the kind of fighting that lay ahead. Within months, Japanese troops surged across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong fell, Singapore collapsed, the Philippines were overwhelmed. American and Allied units were pushed into retreats marked by exhaustion, disease, and confusion. The enemy did not fight the way Europe had taught them to expect. There were no clear fronts, no continuous lines. The jungle erased boundaries. By 1942, American forces found themselves fighting in environments that punished movement and rewarded stillness. Guadalcanal became the first brutal lesson. Dense vegetation limited visibility to yards. Heat drained strength. Rain turned trails into traps. Sound carried unpredictably, while sight failed entirely. And in this chaos, the Japanese sniper became one of the deadliest weapons on the battlefield. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine emphasized patience, concealment, and psychological pressure. Snipers were trained not merely to kill, but to disrupt. They climbed into trees before dawn, cutting small platforms into branches. Others buried themselves beneath leaves and soil, breathing through hollowed reeds. They waited not for targets of opportunity, but for medics, officers, radio men, the men whose loss would ripple through a unit. American troops were not prepared for this. Early war U.S. infantry doctrine placed little emphasis on dedicated snipers. Marksmanship was taught, but precision shooting from concealment was not yet institutionalized. Rifles were expected to be used in volleys or at visible targets. The idea of a single man halting movement across an entire sector seemed foreign. That misunderstanding came at a cost. Casualty reports from Guadalcanal and New Guinea repeatedly mentioned soldiers killed without warning. A helmet lifted above a foxhole, a cigarette lit at dusk, a moment's carelessness, and a man was gone. Units slowed, morale eroded,
Men stopped moving in daylight. Fear spread invisibly, just like the enemy. Compounding the problem was equipment. The standard U.S. service rifle, the M1903 Springfield or the M1 Garand, was accurate, reliable, and powerful, but optics were scarce. Purpose-built sniper rifles existed in small numbers. Scope mounts were fragile. Training programs lagged behind battlefield reality. Meanwhile, Japanese snipers often used Arisaka rifles with low-profile optics or iron sights mastered through long practice. They understood the terrain. They belonged to it. In this environment, adaptability became survival. Some officers began to improvise. They selected their best marksmen and paired them with spotters. Others allowed soldiers to modify weapons in the field. Camouflage became personal, not prescribed. Face paint, netting, local vegetation, anything that broke the human outline. And in this absence of formal structure, a quiet, unconventional solution began to appear. Men who grew up hunting, men who trusted their own rifles more than army issue. Men who arrived carrying weapons bought before the war, through catalogs and gun shops, when no one imagined they would be used against trained enemy soldiers. These rifles did not fit doctrine, they did not fit regulations, but they fit the jungle. And among them was one who would soon prove that precision, patience, and a single well-placed shot could reshape the battlefield, if command was willing to tolerate what it did not yet understand. That tolerance would be tested next, as the war forced American units to confront the uncomfortable reality of how unprepared they truly were. Before the war, America was a nation of shooters. Hunting rifles were common fixtures in rural homes. Marksmanship was a skill learned early, passed down quietly from fathers to sons. Mail-order catalogs, Sears, Montgomery Ward, and Abercrombie & Fitch offered firearms to anyone with a few dollars and patience. A man could select a rifle, choose a scope, and have it delivered to his door without ceremony. When the war came, many of those men answered the call carrying more than uniforms and optimism. They brought habits, skills, and sometimes weapons. In the rush to mobilize after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military expanded faster than its supply systems could manage. Training camps overflowed, equipment shortages were routine, optical sights were scarce and often reserved for specialized units that did not yet exist in meaningful numbers. Officially, privately owned weapons were discouraged. Unofficially, enforcement was uneven. In combat zones, practicality often overruled paperwork. If a rifle worked, if it put rounds where they were aimed, commanders were inclined to look the other way. Still, stigma followed these civilian arms. To regular infantrymen, a hunting rifle seemed out of place. It lacked the weight of regulation steel. Its scope looked fragile. It carried none of the institutional confidence of standardized gear. Men worried about spare parts, ammunition compatibility, and durability in jungle conditions. Some worried it marked the carrier as different, and in combat units, difference invited skepticism. The soldier at the center of this story had heard it all. The jokes came quietly, never malicious but constant. Mail-order gun, deer rifle, sporting toy. In a war defined by mass violence, individuality made others uneasy. Yet the rifle had advantages no one wanted to acknowledge. It was lighter, its trigger was smoother, its scope was calibrated for deliberate fire, not hurried engagements. Most importantly, the man carrying it trusted it completely. He had spent years behind that rifle before the war. He knew its recoil, its quirks, its limits. Where a service rifle required adjustment and familiarity, this one felt like an extension of his body. As Japanese sniper activity intensified, his unit began to suffer. Patrols stalled, casualties mounted without contact. The enemy was invisible, yet omnipresent. Men began to refuse movement unless absolutely necessary. Command needed answers. Desperation lowers barriers. When word reached the unit that a skilled marksman was available, one willing to hunt the hunters, the unconventional rifle became less important than the results it might deliver. There was no formal assignment, no ceremony, just a quiet understanding. Go out, find them, stop them. The jungle did not offer clean sight lines. Snipers were rarely seen directly. Instead, they were inferred from muzzle flashes, disturbed leaves, unnatural silhouettes. Counter-sniping was a war of inference, patience, and restraint. The soldier adapted quickly. He moved before dawn, choosing positions that allowed observation without exposure. He learned to wait for hours without shifting. He studied how Japanese snipers selected trees, angles, escape routes. He began to think like the enemy, and slowly, methodically, the balance began to change. One sniper silenced, then another. Each confirmed kill reduced fear more than it reduced numbers. Movement resumed, confidence crept back. The rifle that once drew smirks now drew attention, not to its origin, but to its effectiveness. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of quiet eliminations that forced a reevaluation of doctrine in real time. The unit was watching something new take shape, not official policy, but battlefield truth. And as this lone marksman continued his work, the story began to reveal itself from multiple angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral. Each one exposing a different cost of fighting a war where silence could be more lethal than artillery. Sniper warfare is defined less by action than by absence. For the man behind the rifle, hours passed without movement, muscles cramped, insects crawled across exposed skin, sweat pooled beneath his chest, soaking into the dirt. He could not swat a mosquito, could not stretch his legs. Even breathing had to be managed, shallow and controlled, so the rise of his back would not betray him. This kind of fighting stripped time of meaning. There was no adrenaline rush, no charge, only waiting, knowing that somewhere nearby another man was waiting too, another soldier trained to notice the smallest error, a misplaced boot, a glint of glass, a breath taken too quickly. Every kill carried weight, not triumph, but consequence. In the quiet that followed, the shooter was left alone with that reality. Yet there was purpose. Men in his unit stopped dying mysteriously. Medics could move again. Officers no longer froze at intersections of jungle trail. The sniper did not see their faces when he fired, but he saw their relief afterward. In this war, stillness became service.
Japanese snipers were not careless adversaries. They selected firing positions with deliberate intent. Trees with overlapping branches, slopes that masked silhouette, locations offering multiple escape routes. They fired sparingly, sometimes once per day, then relocated before retaliation arrived. To counter them required discipline rather than aggression. The American marksmen studied patterns. Japanese snipers often favored specific tree species with dense leaf clusters. They tended to establish positions before sunrise. They avoided repeated shots from the same angle. So he reversed the logic. He watched the trees instead of the ground. He observed birds. Their sudden flight often betrayed a human presence. He waited for the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel among organic chaos. His rifle, with its civilian scope, allowed magnification few others had. It was not built for rapid fire. It did not need to be. One shot was enough. For Japanese snipers, the jungle had been a sanctuary. They were trained to believe invisibility equaled invincibility. Early encounters reinforced that belief. American units moved loudly, carelessly, predictably. The trees offered protection, and the enemy rarely fired back with precision.
That confidence began to erode. Snipers started disappearing without warning. Men who had climbed trees before dawn failed to return. Firing positions went silent. Orders were given to relocate more often, but uncertainty spread faster than guidance. A hunter was now being hunted. The jungle, once familiar, became hostile. Every movement carried risk. Every branch could conceal an American rifle trained upward. Fear did not need language. It traveled through absence. And as this invisible contest intensified, it exposed another truth. Weapons alone did not decide outcomes. The tools mattered, but the way they were used mattered more. That realization would soon force officers to reconsider not just who carried rifles, but which rifles deserved to be trusted.
The rifle was never meant for this environment. Its stock was designed for forests, not jungles. Its scope lacked protective housing. Moisture crept into metal seams. Fogging was a constant threat. Every morning, the marksman checked the glass carefully, wiping condensation away with slow, deliberate movements. Yet its advantages remained undeniable. Civilian scopes prioritized clarity over durability. They offered fine crosshairs, not thick combat reticles. For a patient shooter, this allowed precise placement: eye, throat, shoulder. The rifle's trigger broke cleanly, without the heavy pull common in service weapons. In a war where a single bullet mattered, that difference was decisive. The Army had not yet caught up. Official sniper rifles existed mostly on paper. Field modifications were common but inconsistent. What worked here was not doctrine, but results. Officers watched carefully. At first, the marksman's assignments were informal. Patrol leaders tolerated his presence but did not rely on him. There were no official reports praising his rifle, no commendations. Success was measured quietly by the absence of casualty notifications. As the count grew, skepticism faded. Routes previously avoided were reopened. Patrols requested coverage. Commanders began asking questions, not about regulations, but about methods. How he chose positions, how long he waited, what he looked for first. No one laughed anymore. Leadership in wartime often evolves under pressure. Here, it was shaped by necessity. The rifle that once seemed unprofessional now represented survival. Sniping changes a man. Unlike other forms of combat, it requires deliberation, time to think, time to observe, time to recognize the humanity of the target, even if only in silhouette. There was no chaos to hide behind, no smoke, no explosions, just a decision made in silence. The marksman carried that weight alone. He did not speak about his work. There was no celebration after a confirmed kill, only a quiet acknowledgement from those who understood what it cost, not in physical exertion, but in mental endurance. 4 days of this kind of fighting would leave marks deeper than fatigue. And as the 4th day approached, the jungle grew quieter. Too quiet. Something was changing. The enemy was adapting. Positions were shifting. The final confrontations would come soon, closer, riskier, and more decisive than anything before. The turning point was coming. The 3rd morning began without gunfire. That absence was not comforting. It was suspicious. Japanese snipers rarely abandoned effective ground without reason. Silence suggested movement, not retreat. The jungle felt alert, birds lifting suddenly, insects falling quiet in patches, foliage disturbed just enough to notice if you were trained to see it. The marksman moved before dawn. He selected a position overlooking a narrow corridor of jungle trail where movement had recently resumed. It was not ideal ground, too many angles, too many shadows, but it was necessary. Japanese snipers had learned to watch places where Americans felt safe again. By mid-morning, the first sign appeared, a broken branch, freshly cut, high above the forest floor, not torn by wind, not aged by rot, human work. Nearby, leaves had been arranged unnaturally, overlapping in a way meant to conceal rather than grow. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. At 11:20 hours, sunlight shifted just enough to reveal a straight line cutting through the chaos, the unmistakable geometry of a rifle barrel. It was angled downward, patient, disciplined. The marksman adjusted his breathing. The shot came clean, controlled, final. The body did not fall. It remained suspended in the branches, held by webbing and muscle, until gravity eventually claimed it. The sound carried only briefly before the jungle swallowed it whole. By afternoon, 2 more snipers revealed themselves, not through movement, but through reaction. Japanese doctrine emphasized response. A fallen sniper often drew attention from others attempting to assess the threat. That instinct betrayed them. One fired hastily, the muzzle flash visible even through foliage. Another shifted position too aggressively, disturbing leaves that had been still for hours. 2 shots followed, 2 more bodies removed from the canopy. By the end of the 3rd day, the count had reached 8. Word spread quietly through the American unit. Men began referring to specific trees as cleared. Patrols advanced without halting every few steps. Fear loosened its grip, replaced not by confidence, but by trust. Trust that someone unseen was watching over them. That trust would be tested the next morning. The 4th day began differently. Japanese snipers adjusted their tactics. They abandoned trees in favor of ground-level concealment, shallow pits, root systems, camouflaged depressions that offered no silhouette, no elevated outline. This was closer fighting, dangerous fighting. The marksman had to move more, observe longer, expose himself incrementally. Each adjustment increased risk. Counter-sniping at ground level was a duel of inches, not yards. Near midday, he spotted movement, not a body, but an absence, a patch of jungle floor where leaves had been carefully rearranged, too deliberate to be natural. No visible barrel, no outline, just possibility. He waited. Seconds stretched, then minutes. The Japanese sniper exhaled. That breath sealed it. The 9th shot echoed softly. The 10th came an hour later, under worse conditions. Heat shimmer distorted distance. Sweat threatened his grip. He waited until the image steadied, then fired. The jungle fell silent again. Only one remained. And by then, the enemy knew he was there. The final encounter would not be patient, it would not be distant, and it would decide whether this experiment, this lone marksman and his unorthodox rifle, would end in success or cost. That moment arrived before dusk. Late afternoon light filtered unevenly through the canopy, turning the jungle amber and green in shifting bands. Visibility worsened as shadows lengthened. This was the hour Japanese snipers favored, when the eye struggled to distinguish shape from shadow. The marksman sensed he was no longer in control of the field. Something had changed. Movement came not from concealment, but from intention. The final Japanese sniper was experienced. He did not rush. He did not fire prematurely. He understood that his enemy had eyes trained upward, downward, everywhere. This was no longer hunting. It was a duel. The American shifted position slowly, inch by inch, redistributing weight to avoid sound. His rifle rested against a fallen log, bark stripped smooth by rot. Sweat blurred the edge of his vision. He blinked carefully, knowing even that motion carried risk. Then he saw it. Not a body, not a rifle,
a disturbance in pattern, a shadow that absorbed light differently than the surrounding earth, the kind of imperfection only human intention creates. He waited. Seconds stretched, then minutes. The Japanese sniper exhaled. That breath sealed it. The shot came at 17:30 hours. Short, controlled. The recoil barely lifted the barrel. The body slumped forward, collapsing into the shallow pit it had been carved into hours before. There was no return fire. The jungle did not answer back. When darkness fell, the count stood at 11 Japanese snipers eliminated in 4 days. There was no announcement, no formal tally read aloud. The knowledge traveled informally, through nods and quiet confirmation. Patrol leaders noticed immediately. Movement continued after dusk. Fires were lit again, cautiously, but without panic. The rifle was no longer a curiosity. It was proof. Within days, officers submitted reports emphasizing the need for trained marksmen and proper optics. Lessons learned here would ripple outward, feeding into the formalization of sniper training programs later in the war. The marksman returned his rifle to his sling and faded back into the unit. There was no ceremony, no photograph. The work had been done, and in this war, survival mattered more than recognition. But the effects lingered. Japanese sniper activity in the sector dropped sharply. Routes remained open. Casualties declined. The jungle felt different, not safer, but balanced. For the first time in days, silence did not mean threat. As the unit pushed forward, the question shifted from whether snipers were necessary
to how many could be trained before the next jungle swallowed another battalion whole. The consequences were only beginning to reveal themselves. The most immediate effect was movement. Patrols that had once advanced in hesitant bursts now pushed forward in longer intervals. Men stopped scanning every tree before taking a step. Medics moved with fewer escorts. Communication lines stayed open instead of being hastily rerouted. The jungle did not become safe, it became navigable. Casualty reports reflected the shift. While numbers varied by unit and sector, commanders noted a clear reduction in sniper-related losses in the days following the eliminations. It was not luck, it was absence. The enemy's most psychologically disruptive asset had been neutralized. Morale followed quickly. Soldiers do not need to understand tactics to feel their effects. The simple knowledge that someone was watching, someone capable of seeing what they could not, restored confidence. Fear receded enough for discipline to return. Officers began to document what had worked. Reports emphasized patience over aggression, observation over volume of fire, the importance of optics, camouflage, and individual skill. These observations were informal, often handwritten, but they traveled through command channels nonetheless. Notably, they did not focus on the rifle's origin. What mattered was that it functioned under pressure. Higher command took notice. By late 1943, the Marine Corps and U.S. Army were already experimenting with more formal sniper programs. Experiences like this, small, localized successes, informed those efforts. The marksman himself returned to routine duty. There was no transfer, no promotion tied directly to the kills. In the wartime bureaucracy, individual acts often dissolved into collective progress. But among those who had been there, memory remained precise. They remembered where the snipers had been. They remembered when the fear lifted. They remembered the rifle that changed their behavior before it changed doctrine. Japanese forces adapted in their own way. Surviving units became more cautious. Snipers were deployed more sparingly, often in pairs or with dedicated observers. Some were pulled back entirely as the cost-benefit calculation shifted. The duel had not ended, it had escalated. What had begun as improvisation was becoming systematized on both sides. The Pacific War was learning its own rules in real time, written not in manuals, but in blood and silence. The broader consequences would take longer to surface. They would emerge in training camps far from the jungle, in new manuals, new rifles, and a new understanding of what a single soldier could accomplish when properly equipped and trusted. That transformation did not happen overnight, but its foundations were already set. In the months that followed, the lessons drawn from jungle firefights began to harden into policy. The U.S. Marine Corps, already attuned to the realities of Pacific combat, moved first. By late 1943 and into 1944, formal sniper programs were established, drawing heavily from field experience. These programs emphasized concealment, patience, and marksmanship under pressure, not rapid fire, but decisive fire. The Army followed a similar path, though more gradually. Standardization became the goal. Purpose-built sniper rifles were developed by modifying existing platforms, most notably the M1903 Springfield, fitted with improved optics. Scopes were ruggedized, mounts reinforced. Training manuals addressed the psychological demands of solitary fighting. What had once been tolerated reluctantly was now encouraged deliberately. The influence of early unofficial marksmen was rarely acknowledged by name, but it was unmistakable. Their success provided proof that individual skill could shape outcomes even in an industrial-scale war. Japanese doctrine also evolved. As American countersniping improved, Japanese forces reduced reliance on isolated snipers in favor of integrated defensive systems. Snipers were used to support ambushes rather than operate independently. Their role shifted from disruption to delay. This adaptation reflected a broader truth of the Pacific War. Neither side could afford stagnation. The jungle rewarded learning and punished complacency. The rifle at the center of this story eventually returned to obscurity. It was not preserved in a museum. It did not receive an official designation. Like many tools of war, it fulfilled its purpose and faded back into anonymity. But its legacy endured. Every sniper trained afterward benefited from what had been proven in those 4 days. That patience mattered, that clarity of vision saved lives, that unconventional solutions, when grounded in skill, could overcome institutional hesitation. The marksman carried his experience quietly. There were no memoirs, no interviews. For him, the war continued like it did for millions of others, one day at a time, measured not by victories, but by survival. History remembers generals and divisions. It rarely pauses for the unnamed individuals who forced change through competence rather than command. Yet without them, doctrine remains theory, and theory does not survive first contact with the jungle. As the war pressed on towards its brutal conclusion, the echo of those 4 days lingered, not as legend, but as lesson, shaping how soldiers would fight, watch, and wait in the wars yet to come.
War does not reward conformity for long. It punishes rigidity. It exposes assumptions. And in environments like the Pacific jungle, it strips combat down to its most basic truth. Survival belongs to those who adapt first. The story of one man and his unremarkable rifle is not a tale of heroism in the traditional sense. There were no charges, no banners raised, no speeches delivered afterward. What happened unfolded quietly, measured in patience and restraint rather than spectacle. Yet its impact was real. Those 4 days demonstrated that warfare is shaped not only by strategy and supply, but by trust. Trust in individual skill, in judgment, in the willingness to deviate from doctrine when doctrine falls short. The rifle mattered, but not because it was different. It mattered because it was understood.
Sniper warfare would become formalized, refined, and institutionalized as the war progressed. Training improved, equipment standardized, roles clarified. But those advancements rested on early, uncomfortable lessons learned when necessity forced improvisation. The jungle remembered those lessons long before headquarters did. This story also carries a quieter truth. Precision in war is not mercy, but it is responsibility. To see clearly, to wait deliberately, and to act decisively carries a moral weight that few experience, and fewer still discuss. The men who carried that burden rarely sought recognition for it. History often records outcomes, not the stillness that made them possible. Somewhere in the Pacific, the jungle reclaimed the trees that once held hidden rifles. Leaves fell, branches rotted, silence returned, but the understanding remained, passed from one generation of soldiers to the next, that sometimes the most powerful change comes not from overwhelming force, but from a single, well-placed shot, fired by someone willing to wait until it truly mattered. That is what those 4 days left behind, and that is why they still matter.